Ukamaka agreed to take Daluchi to the city. She promised to enroll Daluchi in a good school and look after her like her own daughter. Dozie was so delighted as he bid his daughter farewell and watched her drive off in his sister's luxurious SUV. After a few hours, they arrived the big city and Daluchi could not believe her eyes. The buildings were so huge, a stark contrast to the huts that Daluchi was used to seeing in the village. They drove through beautiful streets with unique flowers, and Daluchi was so full of excitement. They finally arrived at Ukamaka's home, and Daluchi could not help but stare in amazement. She could not believe that her auntie lived in such a big and beautiful house. They got into the house, and Daluchi could not stop staring around the place. Everything looked so beautiful, and Daluchi could only imagine how heaven would look like if a house on earth could be this beautiful. She was escorted to a very big room, which her auntie said was her room. This was a dream come true for Daluchi, whose entire house in the village was smaller than her new bedroom. The next morning, her auntie Ukamaka enrolled her in a very good school in the heart of the city. She gave her directions back home, as their house was not too far from the school, and left in a hurry for a very important meeting. Daluchi was so excited to resume school. She got to her classroom and realized that the school was so different from her village school. The children in her class seemed to be from wealthy homes, and it was not long before Daluchi began to feel so insecure. She kept to herself as the other girls refused to associate with her. Her village accent and her weird ways of doing things made it obvious that she was not as exposed as they were. During their lunch break, whilst the other children adhered to strict etiquette, Daluchi used her bare fingers to eat her food. They all laughed and pointed at her, calling her all sorts of belittling names. Unable to withstand their mockery, ran away from their presence and locked herself up in the restroom. Too ashamed to return to her class, Daluchi remained in the restroom until the school bell went off. She then snuck out of school, hoping not to be seen by the mean girls in her class that laughed at her all day. She walked briskly for a few minutes, terrified at what would happen if any of her. After a few minutes, Daluchi decided to slow down her pace. Little did she know that the mean girls were trailing her. Just as they were about surrounding Daluchi, a small car pulled up next to her. It was a man who told Daluchi that her auntie sent him to pick her up from school. Daluchi heaved a sigh of relief as she got into the car, thankful for her auntie's timely intervention. They zoomed off as the school bullies stood there and watched her get away. Later that evening, her auntie Ukamaka returned home to realize that her house was empty. She called out for Daluchi, but no one seemed to be home. She looked up at the clock and realized that it was already 7 in the evening. Daluchi should be home by now, she thought to herself as she drove off to the school to check if she was still there. The school gate was shut closed and no students seemed to be in school. She spoke to the school security as to where Daluchi could have gone. Ukamaka returned home and decided to wait. She waited for hours till it was almost midnight, but Daluchi did not return. Could she have missed her way? She thought to herself as she got into her car and drove around, hoping to find Daluchi, but to her utter confusion, Daluchi was nowhere to be found. The next morning, Ukamaka went straight to the school to make a complaint that Daluchi never returned home the previous day. A formal investigation was carried out, and the school authorities, after interviewing the students, got information that Daluchi drove off in a red car the previous afternoon with a man who her auntie sent to pick her up from school. The principal also got information of how Daluchi cried and ran out of her class because her classmates laughed at her, and the principal cautioned the students to desist from such acts. The school principal relayed his findings to her auntie, who denied sending any man to pick Daluchi up from school. She returned home and wondered who the strange man could be. Ukamaka waited patiently for Daluchi to return, but she never did. Days passed and no one had seen or heard from Daluchi. Ukamaka, sensing that something terrible might have happened to her, reported to the police, who began to search the state for her. She decided to visit the village to see if Daluchi might have found her way back to her father, but no one seemed to have seen her in the village. Her father was so distraught as he could not imagine that his daughter, who he just sent to the big city with his sister, was missing. Ukamaka tried to explain what happened to him, but Dozie seemed not to believe her story as he accused her of using his daughter for money ritual. "I knew you were a ritualist. You have succeeded in using my only daughter to renew your pledge with the devil," he said, as Ukamaka stood there and watched as Dozie called on the villagers for help. He narrated how he handed his daughter over to his stepsister to take to the city and how she had just returned to inform him that his daughter was missing. The villagers murmured between themselves as they suspected that Ukamaka had a hand in the disappearance of her niece. "She has used the poor girl for ritual," they whispered between themselves as they stared at her angrily. Ukamaka, sensing that her life was now in danger, got into her car to drive off when the villagers surrounded her car and shattered all her glasses. Ukamaka watched as the people dragged her out of her car and began to beat her up. They called her a ritualist and took her before the village chiefs. Ukamaka tried to explain to the chiefs that she had no hand in Daluchi's disappearance, but the chiefs found it hard to believe as they wondered how Ukamaka made all her money in the city. The men of the village were not used to seeing a woman with such wealth, so no one seemed to listen to her. Dozie then suggested that Ukamaka be tied and kept for 7 nights in the sacred shrine of Alusi to see if she was telling the truth. This was a place where the people dreaded, as the spirit residing within the shrine was known to be a very violent and deadly spirit. Ukamaka knew how dangerous the spirit was and pleaded for the elders to spare her life, as she confessed to them that she was the one behind Daluchi's disappearance. She revealed that Daluchi was still alive in the city at a location that only her knew about. The entire village opened their mouths in shock as the elders ordered her to return to the city to bring Daluchi back to the village. Ukamaka set out for the village park immediately. Her car had been badly damaged by the villagers, so she had no other option but to go in search of a public bus she would use to the city. She arrived at the bus park and was told that there were no buses available. Ukamaka was so exhausted. The ordeal she had to face in the hands of her stepbrother and the entire village terrified her as she stood in the corner, thinking of all the terrible things that could have happened to her. Ukamaka was lost in her own thoughts when a young woman approached her to ask if all was well. She narrated all that happened to her and how she had to lie to the village elders so as to avoid being tied up in the evil shrine of Alusi for 7 days. The young woman sympathized with her as she told Ukamaka that it was too late to leave for the city as there were no buses. She invited Ukamaka to her home to spend the night, as the park was not a place for a woman to be once it was nightfall. Ukamaka was so grateful to her as she followed her home. When they arrived at her hut, she gave Ukamaka her spare room to sleep and served her some food, assuring her that everything will work together for her good. These words put Ukamaka at ease as she ate up her food and went to bed. By morning, Ukamaka prepared to leave for the city. She thanked the kind woman for being so kind to her, despite not knowing who she was. She then headed out and saw something that she never expected to see. Ukamaka saw her stepbrother standing in the corner with his daughter Daluchi. Her eyes opened in shock as she never knew that he was the one behind his own daughter's kidnap. She hid in the corner as she watched him leave. Ukamaka could not believe her eyes. She quickly returned to see the village elders, who were shocked to see her without the child. "Where is she?" they asked angrily, as Ukamaka pleaded with the elders to send some men to follow her. She led them to the hut where she last saw Daluchi, and to their amazement, they saw Daluchi in the hut of her father's concubine. Her father Dozie had always been so jealous of his stepsister Daluchi. He could not understand why she had to be the wealthy one. At the point, he even convinced himself that his sister used his destiny to make money. So, he plotted to ruin her life by ensuring that she was locked up in the shrine of Alusi so that he could use his evil charms to kill her, to make the villagers believe that she was killed by Alusi. This would then prove to them that his sister was truly a ritualist. This was the only way that he believed he could inherit all of his sister's wealth. The elders were so enraged to realize that Dozier deceived them into accusing his innocent sister of a crime that she did not commit. They immediately tied him up and locked him in the shrine of the evil Alusi, who took his life for being evil. Ukamaka, though relieved that the truth had been exposed, was deeply saddened by her stepbrother's betrayal and death. She knew that she was the only family Daluchi had at this point, so she vowed to take good care of her as they both returned to the big city. When they arrived the city, Ukamaka ensured that Daluchi felt secure and loved. She enrolled her in a new school, where she quickly made friends who accepted her for who she was. Over time, Daluchi flourished in her new school, and the bond between herself and her auntie Ukamaka grew stronger as they lived happily in the big city. Ukamaka took care of Daluchi like her own, as their bond became unbreakable, like that of a mother and daughter. The lesson to be learned from this story is that jealousy and envy are dangerous traits that can ruin one's life. We should learn to be contented with what we have, as greed only leads to one's downfall and misery. Finally, we should learn to be resilient in the face of adversity, as doing so can be the channel we need to enable us see the light at the end of the tunnel. I hope you enjoyed the story.